So, good evening, everyone. Hello, saludos. My name is Taina Caragol, and I am curator of painting, sculpture, and Latino art and history. And with Kate Clark LeMay, I am the co-curator of 1898 U.S. Imperial Visions and Revisions. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you. Tonight, I have the distinct honor of introducing our keynote speaker, whose accomplishments are outstanding and abundant. So I will necessarily limit myself to a few notes so we can leave her the stage. Ada Ferrer is the Julius Silver Professor of History and Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University, where she has taught since 1995. Her first book, Insurgent Cuba, Race, Nation, and Revolution, 1868 to 1898, won the Berkshire Book Prize for the best first book by a woman in any field of history. Her second book, Freedom's Mirror, Cuba and Haiti in the Age of Revolution, won several prizes, most notably the Frederick Douglass Book Prize from the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University and several prizes from the American Historical Association. Most recently, in 2022, Ada Ferrer won the Pulitzer Prize in History for Cuba and American History, a sweeping and deeply engaging history of Cuba from before the arrival of Columbus until the present, and its complex ties to the United States. Born in Cuba and raised in the United States, Ada Ferrer has been traveling to and conducting research on the island since 1990. I should say that as art historians, Kate LeMay and I feel deeply indebted to many people who are here today whose scholarship informed our curatorial process and research and writing. Ada Ferrer's books were crucial to our project, as it is impossible to talk about the War of 1898, named by the United States the Spanish-American War, without speaking about the Cuban Wars of Independence, and about the push and pull that brought US politicians from the time of Thomas Jefferson and through the 19th century to ponder, desire, and vision annexing Cuba or folding it into the US sphere of influence. In tonight's keynote address titled Decolonizing 1898, Cuba, the US, and a Matter of Perspective, Ferrer will share what we think we know about 1898 and the US, using the same perspective as in her book, that is, looking at the United States from the outside, from Cuban ground and waters. Her 40-minute lecture will be followed by 20 minutes of Q&A, and then a reception, and you're all invited to that. During the reception, her book and also the exhibition catalog will be for sale at our museum shop, so please drop by. And without further ado, Ada Ferrer. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Before beginning, I want to thank Kate LeMay and Taina Caragol, the curators of the exhibit, for inviting me here, Clara de Paulo for all her help in getting me here, and the director of the museum, Kim Sayed, for this amazing exhibit and opportunity. It's a privilege to be in this museum. And thank you all for being here with us today. Before I begin my talk, I just want to point out the slide under the title. It appears to be an image of the USS Maine entering Havana Harbor on January 25th, 1898. From the writing on the bottom, it appears to be a postcard that was created to commemorate the event. I had never seen this image before, this particular version, I should say, of this image, until yesterday when I was just looking for a picture to put on my title slide, okay? But it was familiar because in my book, I have this image. In the book that she mentioned, Cuba and American History, I have this image. It is the same image, but in this one, there are two boys one who appears to be Black, the other one indeterminate, watching and just sitting, on a rock in the bay, watching as the Maine enters. And of course, in the postcard, they've disappeared. And so I just thought, it's not really part of the talk, but I just thought it's just a nice way to introduce the topic, because part of what we're all talking about is conflicts over history and conflicts over remembrance and meaning. So I think if we talk about the erasure and the silencing of history, here's just a very, concrete example. All right, so my most recent book, Cuba and American History, takes as one point of departure a very simple observation. That is that history looks different depending on where one stands. I use that observation in the book not just to frame the 500-plus year history of Cuba that I tell in the book, but also to reframe the history of the United States itself. I argue that for a place like Cuba, with such deep, long-standing, complex, and uneven connections to the US, a history of Cuba is or can also serve as a kind of history of the United States, a kind of shadow history, a mirrored history, a history of the US told from the margins and from the outside in. I want to do something similar to that for the stories of 1898 here today. The observation that history always differs depending on where one stands is apt in most cases, but I think it is especially so when looking at an event like the War of 1898. In the words of the conference program and the exhibit catalog, it constitutes a controversial chapter in history. Part of the controversy stems from the fact that it encompassed and implicated multiple different actors, states, and empires. And because of the involvement of so many, and because the war and its aftermath proved so consequential for all of them, we might think about the War of 1898 as being an important part of a shared history, a history shared across multiple nations. But this is a common history about which there has never been consensus. So what I'll do here today is revisit that history and talk about the War of 1898, its course, its origins, its course, its meanings, and its legacies, precisely as a source of conflict and contention. To do that, I will reframe the war from the perspective of the place I know best, Cuba, the place, in a sense, where this history begins. On January 25th, 1898, the USS Maine entered Havana Harbor. It was officially a friendly call at port. On the island of Cuba, if not in the city of Havana itself, a movement for Cuban independence was afoot and gaining ground. This war of independence by Cuban rebels against the Spanish colonial state had started 3 years earlier in 1895. By January of 1898, the Spanish had not yet found a way to defeat the movement militarily or spiritually. The highest-ranking general among the Cubans predicted a victory before the end of the year. The Spanish, in an effort to hold the colony, were offering autonomy or home rule under Spain as an alternative. But the rebel forces kept fighting, and peace seemed nowhere in sight. It was amid that uncertainty that the US government decided to send the Maine to Havana and station it in the harbor for a time as a guarantee for US citizens and US property on the island. We know what happened next on February, I forgot the date, okay. At 9:40 p.m., February 15th, sorry, I had February twice. At 9:40 p.m. on Tuesday, February 15th, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 260 American sailors. To this day, Spaniards and Cubans believe that the Americans planned the explosion of the Maine themselves as a pretext for declaring war on Spain and making themselves the rulers of Cuba. Americans preferred a different explanation and blamed Spain from the outset. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy, declared a front-page headline in the New York Journal. Naval officers think the Maine was destroyed by a Spanish mine, read another. The Washington Evening Times was even more definitive and sensationalist. Blown up by Spain, 250 American sailors, the food of sharks. The clamor for war was instantaneous and near unanimous. Even before the sinking of the Maine, calls for war were already popular among an American public attuned to vivid and lurid press reports of Cuban civilians dying in reconcentration camps. After the sinking of the Maine, the calls became thunderous. The New York Journal ran a special 1 million copy run calling on the US to declare war on Spain. The same newspaper boys that Jose Marti had written about years earlier shouted the call to war from street corners. War talk in the Senate, they cried. Spain's time is short. President William McKinley, like his predecessor Grover Cleveland, preferred to protect US interest in Cuba without need of a war, if possible. 1 month after the sinking of the Maine, McKinley instructed his ambassador in Spain to make an offer to purchase Cuba from Spain. As a way for Spain, it would be, said Americans, a way for Spain to resolve the conflict without the humiliation of being vanquished in war, either by the Cuban rebels or by American forces. But like every other American attempt to buy Cuba in the decades before, the new offer went nowhere. The US then attempted to negotiate a peace between Spain and the Cuban rebels. In response to US pressure, Spain called a ceasefire. And then the US tried pressuring the Cubans to do the same and to lay down their arms, but the Cubans refused. Their legal representative in the US explained their decision frankly. Quote, "The reason is a practical one, Mr. President. Nothing you could propose would be so beneficial to Spain and so detrimental to Cuba as an armistice. If an armistice is carried out in good faith, it means the dissolution and disintegration of the Cuban army." End quote. Why would that army dissolve itself without having achieved independence? Now more than ever, said Máximo Gómez, the top military officer in the rebel army, now more than ever, the war must continue in full force. The failure of the US armistice proposal and continuing pressure from Congress and the American public to intervene on behalf of the Cubans seemed to make the war path, or the path to war, irresistible. On April 11, 1898, President McKinley requested authority from Congress to intervene militarily in Cuba. Colorado Senator Henry Teller successfully introduced an article to the joint resolution authorizing war against Spain. Known against the Teller Amendment, it, quote, disclaimed any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island, except for the pacification thereof, and asserted its determination, when that is accomplished, when pacification was accomplished, to leave the government in control of its people, control of the island to its people. With that, the US declared war on Spain on April 20th, 1898, and Spain soon followed suit. That war, declared between those two powers, would seem on the face of it fairly straightforward. For the Americans, it was not particularly deadly. US battle deaths across all the theaters of war numbered under 400. It was also short, 113 days by my count. The first US victory came in the Philippines in May. In June, American forces, among them, of course, the forces of Teddy Roosevelt's famous Rough Riders, landed in eastern Cuba. In the first days of July, the Americans won the Battle of San Juan Hill and destroyed the Spanish fleet off the coast of Santiago. On July 17th, Spanish forces surrendered to US forces in that city of Santiago. Less than a month later, the peace was signed. Then in December, representatives of Spain and the US signed the Treaty of Paris, which transferred Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam from Spain to the United States. Straightforward, brief, as I said. But here is where we must remember that about this shared history, there is no shared vision. We are used to thinking about US power exerted outward, and that makes sense. Right? The US is the empire, it arrives in places, it affects the history. It is easy to focus, not easy, but it is understandable to focus on that power. But as someone who works on the history of a place that was a place where the US landed, I like to think about the ways that the history of those places affects and conditions and shapes and influences what the US can do. Because when the US landed, whether in any of these places, but in thinking about Cuba and Santiago and Daiquiri, they were not arriving on a blank slate or an empty space. The island had a rich and dense history, layers and layers of history that long preceded the war. That history included experiences and structures of indigenous dispossession and European colonization, African enslavement, and plantation monoculture. In the 3 decades before the US declaration of war, it also included a 30-year history of multiracial, multi-class mobilization in search of Cuban independence from Spain. Perhaps to us, already working in 1898, this is fairly obvious. But I am again and again surprised when I talk, for example, to high school teachers, even sometimes college teachers, who teach about the Spanish-American War, that is often still what textbooks call it, with only a passing reference to the War of Cuban Independence that was already raging when the Americans arrived. Among Spaniards as well, sometimes surprisingly, there is little understanding of the war, or the wars, that preceded the conflict with the US. Lay people talk about the US taking Cuba from Spain, without taking into account that the Cubans were already fighting for their independence from Spain. When I once mentioned to the director of a Spanish military archive in the 1990s that I was working on the Cuban Wars of Independence, his reply was, "What war of independence?" He knew about the wars, of course, but to him they were just the Guerra de Cuba. Independence war, he said, ours against France. So the story about these wars, which is so fundamental to understanding 1898, is, to me, it's so, their significance is so obvious, and to scholars, of course, it is as well. But often in the way history is taught in the public, they simply aren't present. And unfortunately, or fortunately, without a deep understanding of the Cuban Revolution, of this preceding Cuban Revolution for independence, there can be no understanding of 1898. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about that prehistory, the Cuban War of Independence that preceded the episode, the American Intervention and War. Cuba's anti-colonial revolution began belatedly in a society that seemed highly unrevolutionary, a society that in the political ferment of the age of revolution earned the designation the ever-faithful Isle. Between 1776 and 1825, as most of the colonies of North and South America acquired their independence, Cuba remained a loyalist stronghold. The story of Cuba's deviance from the hemispheric norm is a familiar one. In the face of potential social revolution, Creole elites, Cuban-born elites, opted to maintain the colonial bond with Spain. With that bond, they preserved as well a prosperous and expanding sugar industry built on the labor of enslaved Africans. In this context, the colonial state and many influential white Creoles asserted that to risk expelling Spain was to invite a possibly more horrible fate. Cuba, they said, would be either Spanish or it would be African. It would be Spanish or it would be another Haiti. For those with the power to decide, the answer came without hesitation. Cuba would remain a Spanish colony. There did exist a handful of prominent intellectuals willing to consider, if only hypothetically, the founding of a Cuban nation independent from Spain. but always they were careful to specify that the Cuban nationality they desired, quote, the only one that any sensible man could concern himself with was a nationality formed by the white race, end quote. The US itself was not absent from this history. Going back to the days of Jefferson, Adams, and Monroe, American statesmen had strategized about how to make Cuba part of the new nation. They discussed explicitly that absent the possibility of acquiring Cuba, the best possible outcome for the US interests would be for Cuba to remain under the rule of a weakened Spain. US government sent representatives to meetings of Latin American states to, among other things, argue against the liberation of Cuba. US policy for much of the 19th century has been characterized as one of a no transfer principle. If Cuba could not be American, it could not be transferred to anyone else. Not, for example, to the British, who were by then pursuing policies of anti-slavery, nor could it be transferred to the Cubans themselves, whom the Americans saw anyway as unfit for self-rule. Over the course of the 19th century, multiple American presidents tried to buy the island of Cuba from Spain to incorporate it into the US. At mid-century, filibustering expeditions launched from the US South sought to separate Cuba from Spain and then asked for immediate annexation to the US as 2, 3, or even 4 slave states. It was into this world that a Cuban revolution erupted on October 10th, 1868. And when it did, it seemed to defy the division and fear that formed the society from which it emerged. Led initially by a handful of prosperous white men, the revolution placed free men of color in local positions of authority. It also freed the enslaved, made them soldiers, and called them citizens. The movement formally inaugurated on that day went on to produce 3 full-fledged anti-colonial rebellions over the next 30 years that followed. The 10 Years' War from 1868 to 78, the Guerra Chiquita, or the Little War, from 1879 to 80, and the final War of Independence, 1895 to 1898, which ended, as we know, with the so-called Spanish-American War. All 3 rebellions were waged by a multiracial fighting force that was integrated at all ranks. Historians estimate that at least 60% of that army was composed of men of color. But this was not just an army where masses of Black soldiers served under a much smaller number of white officers. For many Black soldiers ascended through the ranks to hold positions as captains, colonels, and generals, and to exercise authority over men identified as white. By the end of the 30-year period, according to estimates of one historian, about 40% of the commissioned officers were men of color. If this integrated army was one pillar of the revolution, the other was significantly less tangible. It was a powerful rhetoric of anti-racism that began emerging during the first rebellion and that became much more dominant in the years between the legal end of slavery in 1886 and the outbreak of the third and final war in 1895. This new rhetoric made racial equality a foundation of the Cuban nation. Espoused by both white and non-white members of the movement's civilian and military branches, it asserted that the very struggle against Spain had transformed Cuba into a land where there were, quote, no whites and no Blacks, but only Cubans, end quote. It thus condemned racism, not as an infraction, or not only as an infraction against individual citizens, but as a sin against the life of the would-be nation. Revolutionary rhetoric made racial slavery and racial division concomitant with Spanish colonialism, just as it cast the revolution as a mythic project that armed Black and white men together to forge a new nation that would transcend race. That this revolution emerged from that slave society makes the story of Cuban independence a remarkable and compelling one. That it emerged from the late 19th century world makes it even more so. For the Cuban Revolution unfolded as European and North American thinkers linked biology to progress and divided the world into superior and inferior races. Those ideas, espoused or encouraged by the work of thinkers as diverse as Charles Darwin or Herbert Spencer or Joseph Arthur Gobineau, had a profound influence in Latin America. Yet, in that world, under Darwin's sway, to quote Martí, the Cuban movement's principal intellectual leader, José Martí, professed the equality of all races. Indeed, he went further, boldly asserting that there was no such thing as race. Race, he and others insisted, was merely a tool used locally to divide the anti-colonial effort, and globally by men who, he said, invented textbook races in order to justify empire and expansion. Here then were voices raised not only in opposition to Spanish rule, but also in opposition to the prevailing common sense of their time. Moreover, that Cuban leaders preached and much less perfectly practiced, what Cuban leaders preached and much less perfectly practiced, stood in stark and concrete contrast to the emerging racial politics of their neighbor to the north. Cuban rebels spoke of a nation that transcended race in the period that represented the nadir in American racial politics. Thus, the waves of racial violence in both North and South, the spread of spatial segregation by race, and the dismantling of the political gains made during Reconstruction in the South occurred in the US precisely as Afro-Cuban leaders gained increasing popularity and power in Cuba. Arguably the most popular military leader of the nationalist movement was Antonio Maceo, who had joined the movement in 1868 as a common foot soldier and rose eventually to the rank of general. By 1895, he led the insurgent army across the entire territory of the island and as an Afro-Cuban, won the allegiance of white and non-white men and women. A national multiracial following that in the United States would have been rare in local contexts and unthinkable at the national level. Thus, as the color line in the US grew more and more rigid, and as the consequences for crossing that line became more and more brutal, a revolutionary movement in Cuba appeared willing, even sometimes eager, to eradicate those lines in Cuba. When the US intervened in 1898, Cuban insurgents believed that victory was at hand. In January, Máximo Gómez, head of the Liberation Army, had predicted victory before year's end. The first time, he said, he dared to make a prediction that specific. Cuban leaders planned for their final assault, certain that Spain's defeat was imminent. In a confidential memorandum, the US Secretary of State seemed to agree. He wrote, quote, "Spain's struggle in Cuba has become absolutely hopeless. Spain is exhausted financially and physically, while the Cubans are stronger," end quote. To see Cuba's 19th century revolution in this light, as an ambitious, anti-colonial, and anti-racist project, forces us to reconsider certain questions. First, it allows potentially for new perspectives on American imperialism. American historians of empire invariably discuss US intervention, for it has traditionally been seen as an event that signaled the emergence of the United States on a world stage. But Cuba itself is often largely absent from those discussions as they search for the causes of intervention within the United States, in the need to unify the country, unify between North and South in the wake of the Civil War and social unrest, in the frenzy for markets for expanding capitalist industry, or in the closing of the frontier. So just as Teddy Roosevelt ignored Cuban insurgents, so too have imperial historians generally neglected the complex history of insurgency and counterinsurgency that unfolded in the 3 decades preceding the United States declaration of war on Spain. As a result, They have overlooked the extent to which conditions in Cuba and the internal story of the revolution itself helped shape the possibilities for US intervention. With Cuba and race at center stage, there might emerge new motivations, new meanings, and new dynamics behind American intervention. Remember, the US government had never before supported independence, the independence of Cuba. Often it had worked actively against it. American intervention in April, given the history that I've just told you, and keeping that fact in mind, then, we can perhaps conclude that American intervention in April 1898 was not meant to help Cubans achieve a victory over Spain. That was likely forthcoming anyway. American intervention was meant precisely to block it. A Haitian anthropologist by the name of Michel Rouf-Triot once observed that history always exists in two registers, that of the event and that of the stories that are told about the event. So let's talk about the War of 1898 in that way. American media and American statesmen at the time and since cast these events, the War of 1898, the explosion of the Maine, and so on, as an act, well, they cast the intervention of the US in Cuba as an act primarily of benevolence. In the United States, in this version of history, acted together with the Cubans to expel Spain and help a close neighbor achieve their independence, as the US had achieved more than a century earlier. At the time, as Luis Perez has so amply documented, Americans believed that as a result, Cubans owed their nation with a debt of gratitude. That's a direct quote. That notion of a debt of gratitude lasted much longer, or the expectation of a debt of gratitude, the expectation of gratitude, I should say, lasted much longer than we might at first assume. Take the US, and now we're going to switch gears a little bit and fast forward in time. Take the US response to the Cuban Revolution of 1959 that brought Fidel Castro to power. Recall, or think, maybe not recall, just reminding you that in 1959, the Spanish-American War, the War of 1898, was still a living memory for some US citizens. And in the context of the Revolution of 59, the invocation of the Spanish-American War became a staple in many responses at the time to Fidel Castro. In the words of one senator in 1960, quote, "We, who in living memory rescued the island from medieval bondage, we who have given order, vitality, technical wisdom, and wealth are now being damned for our civilizing and cooperative virtues," end quote. That was a senator in 1960. President Eisenhower, who had been 8 years old at the time of the war, voiced the same sentiment, quote, "We were the ones who set them free. And when they got into trouble, we had an occupation. And again, we set them on their feet and set them free," end quote. Why then, he wondered, would the Cuban government challenge the US now? One landowner, owner of the King family, which owned the largest piece of property anywhere in the US and Texas, also owned land in Cuba. When some of that land was expropriated in the first agrarian reform of 1898, that landowner advised Eisenhower to remind the Cubans, quote, that in 1898, we fought to free Cuba from Spanish tyranny. We will not stand by now and allow communism to purposely destroy this freedom. Such sentiments, widely held in the US of 1959, right? More than 50 years after the events of 1898, exemplify perfectly the permanent impasse in Cubans and Americans' understanding of their shared history. For most Americans, 1898 represented an American gift of freedom to the Cubans, when US troops and the general public had rallied to the cause of Cuban independence and declared war to achieve independence on the island's behalf. Many Americans firmly believed that Cuban independence had been a gift of the Americans. For Cubans, however, 1898 represented something entirely different. For them, 1898 was the moment when the US swept in at the end of a war that the Cubans had essentially already won, and then claimed victory and proceeded to rule over Cuba as a de facto colonial power. A US military government of occupation ruled Cuba from 1899 to 1902. During that time, that US occupying government dismantled the Cuban Liberation Army, something which I still heard talked about in the 90s on the nightly news in Cuba when I was there doing research. The US government of occupation also issued, among the many other things it did, it issued orders that resulted in significant dispossession of land and facilitated the US purchase of it, especially in eastern Cuba, which at the time was less developed. Importantly, the US also essentially forced Cubans to accept as a condition of US withdrawal in 1902, something called the Platt Amendment that authorized further US occupations and interventions in Cuba. And they did occur. So there was a second occupation in 1906, 1909, and then not full-scale occupations, but interventions later in the teens. And I just put all the other ones in this period because, when I teach this, when I do my Caribbean history class and I show these, I do them like one by one, and the students are always shocked. And many of them, though they've been, had no idea of this U.S. continuing presence in the Caribbean. Given this history that I've been describing, Cubans don't believe that they owed the U.S. a debt of gratitude. Rather than benevolence, they see it as something closer to theft, to put it in blunt terms. For generations, every Cuban school child, among them my parents, born in 1921 and 1926, was taught to recite the poem Mi Bandera by Bonifacio Byrne, a poem that tells of his return to Cuba shortly after the war, when he's entering Havana Harbor and sees over the morro, not a Cuban flag, but an American flag. And, my mother in her 90s could still recite this poem from memory. So, I mention my mother because I love mentioning my mother, but also just to give you a sense that it's not just radicals who believe this. This was part of the way Cuban children were taught, even in the 30s and 40s, long before Fidel Castro came to power. In another illustration of the difference of opinion, here's the cover of an important book published in Havana in 1950. It makes its argument very clear, even with the title. That's in Spanish. For those of you who don't read Spanish, it just says, Cuba does not owe its independence to the United States. So far, I have just tried very quickly and in passing to shift perspectives from a US one to a Cuban one. Doing so forces us to question certain imperial narratives and assumptions. And it also brings to light an anti-colonial movement in Cuba that I think has not received the attention it deserves. Michel Rouve-Trillot once used the phrase, "a revolution the world forgot," to refer to Haiti, which makes complete sense. But I think we can say the same thing about this 19th century Cuban revolution as well. And here I want to refer briefly to José Martí, who I've mentioned in passing before, the Cuban political thinker and writer who lived most of his adult life in New York City and who was the principal exponent of Cuban anti-colonial thought. Writing about the War of Independence that began in 1895, and in which he would be killed shortly after he penned these words, Martí asserted that the Cuban Revolution was a revolution for the world. It sought national independence, yes, but that particular independence would also, he said, be a boon to the whole world. How? Martí had two answers to that. First, for him, the Cuban Revolution modeled a new kind of society, a former slave society that would create a nation for blacks, whites, and everyone, a nation for all, he called it, a republic for all. What would make the Cuban Revolution worthy and important was precisely that it was being forged from below by what he called at the time, quote, the vigorous masses, the skilled and inspiring mestizo masses of this country, the intelligent, creative masses of whites and blacks, end quote. The second reason that Martí thought a successful conclusion to the Cuban War of Independence would benefit the world was that he believed that a Cuban victory would put a brake on US imperial designs in Latin America. If the Americans took Cuba, he believed they would expand beyond and into parts of the Caribbean and South America. Cuban independence then was not just an anti-colonial project against Spain, it was also an anti-imperialist struggle in the Americas. But to leave the story there, to show merely that there existed an ambitious anti-colonial and anti-racist movement that preceded the War of 1898 would still be gravely inadequate. For to understand the revolution that preceded and helped produce American intervention, another kind of challenge is required. A challenge not only to the revolution's invisibility in US historical consciousness, but also to its centrality and coherence in Cuban national consciousness. Because if the exigencies, if the needs of empire in the United States rendered the 30 years of anti-colonial struggle that preceded American intervention largely irrelevant, then the dictates of state-sanctioned revolutionary nationalism in post-59 Cuba made those same struggles absolutely indispensable. The new state after 1959, by its own account, represented the fulfillment and embodiment of 19th century patriotic ideals, thwarted by the intervention of the US in 1898 and by the decades of direct and indirect American rule that followed. Thus, if anti-colonial struggle between 1868 and 1898 was reduced to roughly 4 months of the Spanish-American War in imperial nomenclature, in the new revolutionary lexicon, it became 100 years of struggle, from the first anti-colonial uprising in 1868 to the revolutionary present then of the 1960s. 19th century struggles were thus central components in a new historical consciousness and a central feature of the new state's attempt to win historical legitimacy. Because the post-59 state construed itself as a fulfillment of those 19th century ideals, there was little room for discussion about the character and complexities of that original revolution. The 19th century movement appropriated after 1959 was thus so abstract and instrumental that in effect, the struggles and protagonists of the late 19th century were almost as absent and shadowy in nationalist scholarship as they were in imperial historiography, despite their radically different political orientations. 30 years of conspiracies organized and betrayed, of alliances made and broken, of courses altered and modified, became simply an abstract, though admittedly rousing tale of a people with a big P and their struggle for a nation with a big N. The obscurity around anti-colonial insurgency, imposed initially by the contempt and arrogance of empire, remains in many ways unchallenged by the romance and teleology of nationalist narratives. To recapture and reinterpret this extended moment then requires an assault on both imperial silences and nationalist pretensions. To decolonize 1898 then is not just to trouble the historical narratives of imperial states, but perhaps more so, a la Howard Zinn, to trouble the historical narratives of all states, even purportedly anti-colonial and anti-imperial ones. I believe that Cuban historiography has tended to downplay what I think was one of the principal conflicts at the heart of the movement, namely the one around race. If Martí believed in both the anti-imperialist and the anti-racist thrust of the 19th century revolution, the post-1959 Cuban state has focused primarily on the first of those, the anti-imperial one. If anything, it asserts that it was US intervention that subverted the anti-racist promise of revolution. But I argue the seeds of that subversion were already present within the movement itself. So we can tell a story of that movement that highlights conflict, that brings to light other stories. Yes, it tells the story of Martí, but it makes equally important the world that surrounded Martí in New York, the work of men like Rafael Serra, a Black journalist, educator, and writer who worked closely with Martí in New York and founded a school for Black Caribbean workers, and founded something called La Liga Antiana based in downtown Manhattan, where Martí taught every Thursday night at the school. Jesse Hoffman-Garskoff has done amazing work on this, by the way, and I can give anyone the reference who wants it. We can tell the story of the Black general Antonio Maceo, who I mentioned before led the invasion from east to west, the most prominent Afro-Cuban in the war. But we can also tell those of Quintín Bandera, another veteran of the 3 wars of independence, who was court-martialed by the Liberation Army in 1897 for infractions that white officers committed with impunity, and who was assassinated on the orders of the independent Cuban Republic in 1906. We can talk not about the abstract multitudes that constitute the people in search of the nation, but highlight the specific presence of people like Rosa Castellanos, also known as Rosa La Mesa. This is a page from her service record in the Cuban National Archives. We can talk about people like Ricardo Batrel Oviedo, a sugar worker who joined the movement who joined the Liberation Army as it crossed from east to west, attacking plantations on their path. He was a sugar worker and joined. It also requires that we undo a different narrative about gratitude. I talked about the debt of gratitude. Okay. The US claimed Cuba owed a debt of gratitude. There is a way in which the Cuban state that emerged after the Americans left in 1902 echoed that narrative in a different way. The new state, composed of white men, more eager to reconcile with Spain and more ready to assimilate the new reality of US power than they were willing to live up to the discourse of anti-racism. When Black veterans of the war claimed their due, their answer was always no. It wasn't convenient. To assert their rights as Black men, said the president Tomás Estrada Palma, was to be racist. Black veterans, these white elite leaders said, Black veterans owed the independence revolution their own debt of gratitude for inviting them into history. So it falls on us to change what that history is, what the container of history is, to reframe it as this 1898 exhibit does, as the work of many of the people here is doing. Because history, after all, did not belong to the US. It did not belong to a Creole white elite. It wasn't theirs to offer to anyone else. So we have to retell it and reframe it in a way that takes that fact as a point of departure and write more histories from the outside in and from the margins. Thank you. Should I?
Or you just did a great job. Answered everybody's questions.
Okay. I'll give people time, but in the meantime,
Could you keep the one up with the list of the dates?
Oh, sure, I was gonna keep this one up, just because it's so interesting, but I'll keep the one with, this one? Yes.
No,
Oh, the intervention, sorry.
I have a question. Over here,
Yeah, okay.
over here. I'm the curator of women's history at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, so very excited for the exhibition to think about interventions with my own research, particularly around Black internationalism and the Pan-African movements. And when you're thinking about and saying, you know, one of your early books was looking at the Haitian Revolution's influence on Cuban revolutions. And I have been thinking about why is Cuba so absent from Pan-African conversations and research, as well as Black internationalism. And I started thinking, well, does the anti-racist and multiracial coalition mean that Pan-Africanism has no place in Cuban history? So I'm very curious about your thoughts about that.
No, I mean, I think that, well, there's a few ways to answer that. There are, this language of anti-racism and of, you know, all Cuban is more than black, white, it is all Cuban, is very, very powerful. It emerged in this moment that I'm describing, but it becomes powerful after that. And it's so powerful that when I first went to Cuba in 1990 to begin my research in the Cuban National Archives and said, I want to look at Black participation in the war, archivists and some historians say, you can't do that, because by then Cubans were more, they basically used the words of Martí and others as fact, but of course it wasn't fact. That was only ever an argument. It wasn't, like, it was never true, right? But it was what they espoused as a vision. And espousing that vision coming out of a slave society is an interesting thing. So I do think that the power of that vision has made it very hard to organize around racial lines. And the classic example there is the war of the so-called race war of 1912, in which Black veterans who were really upset at how little they had received, you know, and basically they made their, you know, they started a party, they produced a newspaper, and in the newspaper they said, you know, what's it called, like the pantheon of Cuban leaders and Cuban heroes is full of Black men. We have made this country with the sweat of our work as enslaved people and with our blood as soldiers, but we're not being allowed into this republic. It's being taken from us, right? But as soon as they started that party, it was illegalized. Forces were mobilized against them by the Cuban government, and many of the forces that were mobilized against them, and who murdered innocent Cuban Blacks were white Cubans who had fought in the wars of independence that supposedly represented this anti-racist vision. So I don't want to give the sense that this is a vision that's true. That's not true at all. But it is very powerful, and to speak against it always mobilizes that kind of response. And even, so I mean, I got something similar when I went in 1990. You look at something like the debates around the 1940 Constitution in Cuba, and it's like the same thing over and over again. So I do think that is part of the story, but there are instances where something happens. So for example, like Marcus Garvey, you know, Marcus Garvey was in Cuba, and there were Garvey clubs in Cuba. You had someone, I've read letters in the Cuban National Archives, in the US National Archives years ago, by a Black man in Cuba who basically said, I am African, I am not Cuban. Like, I don't want to be here, right? So there are like examples like that, but it's hard to get at. I'm going on too long here, but I just want to mention one thing that I love mentioning. It's a Black carpenter in early 19th century Havana who led a movement against slavery, and he was also an artist, and he created a book of paintings that was kind of an Afrocentric vision of the world. The book was destroyed. We don't have it, so we only have his description. So I do think that there are other stories here, but they're much harder to get at, and they're up against enormous obstacles.
What was the name of the artist?
Jose Antonio Aponte. He was a carpenter and a woodworker, and he created this book that had 72 images. He said he created it for his own enjoyment and entertainment. And he created, he had images of everything. There was an incredible, I mean, just based on the descriptions, because we don't have the book. He was executed by the government, but he described the book during his trial. I write about it in chapter 7 of my second book, if anyone's interested. So, yeah.
Question, why didn't the Cuban Revolutionary Army fight on against the United States?
Why did the Cuban Revolutionary
Why didn't the Cuban
They didn't-
Revolutionary Army
Yeah,
fight on against the United States?
Yeah, basically, they didn't think they could win, is one answer. But second, I think, the Cuban leaders would say, like, this is an impasse that we don't understand. And we are before, I think it was Gomez, or maybe it was Calixto Garcia who said, we're before a tribunal that's deciding our future, which is the Americans. And they believed that the quickest way to get the Americans out was precisely not to fight, that if they tried fighting, they would stay longer. So they were saying, and when black veterans say, we want this, we want that, the Cuban white leaders would say, let's wait until the Americans are gone. And then it didn't happen anyway, but their idea was to show themselves fit for self-rule by not fighting.
And so the United States had great resources to devote that Spain didn't have?
Yes,
Is that the
yes,
idea?
yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Hello, my question is, can you draw any parallels between the Cuban fight for independence from Spain and the Puerto Rican fight for the same thing, and the importance of a figure like Lola Rodriguez de Tio?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so one thing, actually, I meant to mention this, and then I meant to include this, and I left it out. Cuban independence, by the people who were most active in fighting it, was always seen as the first step, and it was to be followed by Puerto Rican independence, right? That was always, so Jose Marti's newspaper, Jose Marti's political party in New York that was devoted to independence, always said it was created explicitly for the independence of Cuba and Puerto Rico. So it was always part of the vision and part of the idea. Rodriguez de Tio, I mean, she was in Cuba after the Americans were there, and I think she was, one of an exemplary figure who basically mourned what was happening, right? What was happening in Cuba, and then what was happening at the same time in Puerto Rico. And she would even, and then after the Americans left in 1902, left under the Platt Amendment, she would, I don't know that I can say much more than that, really, but I mean, there's this really great Cuban memoir from that period that talks about her discussions with Cubans, specifically around this issue, and her, her sadness about it. Yeah. What's that?
Her portrait is in the exhibition.
Oh, great. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Could you comment on the efforts of the Clinton administration and then the Obama administration to improve the relationship with Cuba and the response of the Cuban government?
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't think Clinton did much, and if anything, it's the period, when Clinton came to power, it's the special period, it's after the fall of the Soviet Union. He was interested in improving relations, but the Cubans made it impossible for him to do so because they shot down a plane of Cuban Americans. So, it was politically impossible for Clinton to do anything. And then the Cubans made it impossible. Yeah, the Cubans made it impossible. And then Congress said that no American president could lift the embargo without congressional authorization, which then doubly or further made it impossible. I supported Obama's opening. I mean, it doesn't have much to do with the paper, but actually, in some ways, not so much with the paper, but what I thought. I was in Havana when Obama was there, and it was just a remarkable thing to see, just the sense of among people that something was shifting and something, that there was hope that maybe, like it's been the same thing for so long, maybe something's gonna lift, something's gonna just move, right? And I thought that one of the most interesting parts of the visit was his speech. And his speech was really an interpretation of history. And it was an interpretation of history that recognized some of the role of the US in what happened, which is kind of remarkable for a US president. And it was also a vision of history that specifically highlighted the role of Afro-Cubans, which is also remarkable for a US president. So I thought it was a fascinating moment full of promise that, we all know what happened then. Oh, on the Cuban side, that's really interesting because I think Obama really scared them, actually. When I was there, everyone was so into it, and people were watching on TV the way he talked to entrepreneurs, and I mean, it was just, not everyone, of course, but even the tone of the nightly news, which of course is it's state news, right? Media is completely controlled by the state. They would have these, the night before he arrived, they had a program about him and his past. A few days before, they had a program about Americans who fought in the wars of independence, So it seemed like this promising moment, reconciliation. We're not, even the billboards, all those combative billboards that said things like, Mr. Imperialist, we have absolutely no fear of you, things like that, those were taken down, or some of them at least. And I saw a lot of the billboards were more about friendship and peace and things like that. But interestingly, after Obama left, and I can't remember the exact date because I wasn't expecting to, anyway. Fidel Castro wrote an article in the paper that excoriated Obama. And after that, the tone shifted. Yeah. Oh, wait, there's people at the microphone.
I was just curious about if you found any evidence of perhaps, sort of an alliance or communication between leaders of the resistances, not just in the Caribbean, but also, say, in the Philippines, maybe communicating with leaders in the Caribbean. All of the resistance, these efforts were happening around the same time.
Yeah.
I wondered if they maybe communicated.
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely in the Caribbean and Latin America they did. I wouldn't be surprised, the Philippines, but I haven't seen explicitly that evidence. But I also haven't done this original archival work on that in a while. The first time I worked in the Spanish National Archives, there were boxes and boxes and boxes that were labeled Cuba Politica, and it was all stuff on the Philippine insurrection that was mislabeled. It's been fixed since, but yeah, and there, and many people have written about the link, the parallels between a figure like Martí and Rizal, but I don't know specifically about communication.
Well, thank you so much, Ada Ferrer, for your brilliant lecture, and thank you for being here, all of you. And please, let's now go up to the reception.